For generations, the dust-choked dirt of Hollis County offered nothing but broken dreams. When a greedy local dynasty sold 50 barren acres to a desperate outsider for $5,000, they thought they'd pulled the ultimate scam. They were wrong. That wasteland was hiding a $40 million secret. The sun beat down on the cracked earth of Hollis County, Texas, baking the soil into something resembling shattered concrete. This was a land that did not forgive, and the people who controlled it were even less forgiving. For 3 generations, the Caldwell family had ruled the local agricultural scene. Brothers Thomas and Henry Caldwell owned over 10,000 acres of prime, irrigated farmland, effectively controlling the local water board, the county council, and the fate of anyone who dared to challenge their monopoly. To the Caldwells, land was power, but not all land was created equal. Sitting on the far western edge of their vast empire was a 50-acre plot known locally as the Devil's Skillet. It was a desolate, jagged stretch of hardpan and mesquite bush that hadn't seen a drop of surface water in 4 decades. Previous attempts to drill wells there in the late 1970s had yielded nothing but dry dust and broken drill bits. It was a useless tract, an ugly scar on the Caldwell portfolio, and costing them a minor but annoying sum in annual property taxes. Enter Joanne Higgins. At 38, Joanne was a widow running out of options. After her husband passed away from a prolonged illness that drained their savings and left her with a mountain of medical debt, she decided to leave the bustling suburbs of Houston for a fresh start. Joanne had a dream, albeit a naive one, of starting a small, sustainable farm specializing in drought-resistant botanicals like lavender, aloe, and agave. She had researched soil types, read countless agricultural journals, and saved up exactly $6,000 to buy a small piece of the world she could call her own. When Joanne posted an advertisement in a regional agricultural bulletin looking for affordable land, Thomas Caldwell saw an opportunity that was too good to pass up. Thomas, a man whose tailored suits sharply contrasted with the muddy boots of the men he employed, invited Joanne to a local diner in the town of Stanton to discuss a prime opportunity. He sat across from her, swirling a glass of sweet tea, projecting the image of a benevolent local patriarch. "Ms. Higgins," Thomas drawled, flashing a practiced, sympathetic smile. "I understand you're looking for a fresh start. I admire a woman with grit. I have a 50-acre parcel out west. Now it needs a little love, I won't lie to you, but it's got potential for the right, hard-working person. I usually wouldn't let it go for less than $20,000, but hearing your story, I'm willing to part with it for $5,000. Joanne, desperate and blinded by the prospect of finally owning property, didn't notice the subtle smirk on Henry Caldwell's face in the background. She hadn't hired an independent surveyor. She hadn't checked the county's historical drilling logs. She only saw the 50 acres on a beautifully drawn topographical map Thomas slid across the table. She signed the papers that afternoon, handing over a cashier's check for $5,000. As she walked out of the diner, the Caldwell brothers burst into uproarious laughter. They had just unloaded their most worthless liability on a clueless city woman. The joke spread through Stanton like wildfire. By sunset, everyone in the county knew Joanne Higgins as the fool who bought the Devil's Skillet. The harsh reality set in the moment Joanne parked her battered pickup truck on her new property a week later. The July heat was suffocating, hovering at a blistering 104 degrees. The ground wasn't just dry, it was violently arid. The wind whipped up clouds of fine, stinging dust that coated her clothes and lungs. In the center of the property stood the rusted remains of an old pump jack, a monument to previous failures. Joanne walked up to the old well casing and dropped a small stone down the pipe. She waited for the splash. It never came. Just a dull, echoing thud of stone hitting dry earth hundreds of feet below. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the sweltering heat. She spent the next 3 weeks trying to work the land by hand, renting a small tiller to break the soil. The machine simply bounced off the hardpan, vibrating so violently it left her hands blistered and bleeding. She tried bringing in water tanks on the back of her truck, but the cost of hauling water from 50 miles away was astronomical. Her remaining $1,000 evaporated in a matter of days. The locals offered no help. When she went into town for supplies, she heard the whispers. She saw the Caldwell's farmhands pointing and snickering. Thomas Caldwell even drove past her property in his air-conditioned truck one afternoon, slowing down just enough to roll down the window and watch her struggle with a broken shovel, a look of profound amusement on his face. Joanne was completely isolated, physically exhausted, and financially ruined. Sitting on the tailgate of her truck one evening, watching the sun dip below the jagged horizon, she finally broke down. She cried for her late husband, for her lost savings, and for the sheer, cruel humiliation of it all. The Caldwells had sold her a graveyard. But as the tears dried, a quiet, desperate rage began to take root in Joanne's chest. She refused to be the punchline of Thomas Caldwell's cruel joke. If the surface of the land offered nothing, she would have to look deeper. She didn't know it yet, but beneath the cracking soil and her own shattered expectations, the earth was hiding something monumental. The Caldwells had built their empire on arrogance, and that very arrogance had caused them to make the biggest mistake of their lives. Desperation breeds unorthodox alliances. Joanne knew she couldn't afford a major commercial drilling company. The big outfits in Hollis County were all in the Caldwells' pockets anyway. None of them would dare step foot on the Devil's Skillet without Thomas's blessing. She needed someone independent, someone who didn't care about local politics, and someone cheap. That brought her to David Lawson. Lawson was a 62-year-old independent hydrologist and wildcat driller who operated out of a cluttered, grease-stained garage 2 counties over. He had a reputation for being brilliant, but impossibly stubborn. More importantly, he had a long-standing grudge against the Caldwell family, who had forced his father out of the irrigation business decades prior. When Joanne approached Lawson with her property deed and her pitiful remaining budget, she had pawned her wedding ring and taken out a high-interest title loan on her truck to scrape together another $10,000. He initially laughed. "The skillet?" Lawson chuckled, wiping motor oil from his calloused hands with a rag. "Lady, I'm sorry for your troubles, but you got fleeced. My old man looked at that land in the 80s. The bedrock under there is solid granite and limestone. It's a geological dead zone." Joanne didn't flinch. She slammed a stack of geological survey maps she had spent the last week pulling from the state archives onto his workbench. "Your father looked at the state's surveys from 1965. I pulled the satellite topographical data from last year. Look." Lawson sighed, pulling a pair of reading glasses from his flannel shirt pocket. He leaned over the maps, fully intending to dismiss her, but as his finger traced the topographical lines, he stopped. He pulled out a magnifying glass, tracing a faint, almost imperceptible shadow running diagonally across Joanne's 50 acres. "This is a tectonic microfault," Lawson murmured, his brow furrowing. "The old surveys missed it because it's covered by 90 feet of clay. The Caldwells drilled their test wells right in the center of the basin, hitting the granite shield." "And if we drill on the fault line?" Joanne asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lawson looked up, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "If this fault connects to the lower Deep Rock Aquifer, it bypasses the regional water table completely. It would tap into ancient, pressurized glacial melt, but the rock is incredibly dense. It'll chew up drill bits like candy. $10,000 only buys you about 3 days of drilling with my old rig. If we don't hit water by 400 feet, you're officially bankrupt, and I'm out of a lot of expensive equipment." "Let's get to work," Joanne said. 2 days later, Lawson's ancient rusted rotary drilling rig rumbled onto the Devil's Skillet. The arrival of the massive, noisy machinery did not go unnoticed. Word quickly reached the Caldwell brothers that the city widow was actually trying to drill. The drilling process was an agonizing ordeal. The noise was deafening, a relentless, mechanical scream as the diamond-tipped bit ground into the unforgiving limestone. For the first 2 days, they pulled up nothing but gray rock dust. The Texas sun beat down relentlessly, turning the drilling site into an oven. Joanne worked alongside Lawson, covered head to toe in grease and dust, hauling heavy pipe casings and monitoring the engine temperatures. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, The mood turned grim. They had reached 380 feet. The rig was overheating, belching black smoke into the clear blue sky. Lawson had already replaced 2 broken drill bits, eating deeply into their meager budget. "Oh, we're running out of pipe, Joanne," Lawson yelled over the roar of the diesel engine, wiping sweat from his eyes. "And the engine is running red hot. We might have another 20 feet before she blows a gasket." Just then, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the edge of the property line. Thomas and Henry Caldwell stepped out, wearing crisp button-down shirts and mirrored sunglasses. They didn't cross the property line, leaning against the hood of their vehicle with cold, mocking grins. They had come to watch the final act of Joanne's financial ruin. Joanne felt a sickening knot in her stomach. She looked at the gauge on the rig. They were at 395 feet. "Keep going," Joanne screamed at Lawson, her voice cracking. "Do not stop." Lawson gritted his teeth and pushed the throttle forward. The rig shuddered violently. The metal groaned, protesting the immense friction beneath the earth. 400 feet. 405. The drill was shaking so hard, Joanne thought the entire rig was going to tip over. The Caldwell brothers were openly laughing now, pointing at the black smoke pouring from the exhaust. Then, at 418 feet, the tone of the engine changed. The high-pitched mechanical scream suddenly dropped into a deep, guttural thud. The drill pipe lurched downward, dropping a full 2 feet in an instant. "We broke through the caprock," Lawson yelled, his eyes widening in alarm as the pressure gauges on the rig suddenly spiked into the red zone. "Get back, Joanne, move." Joanne scrambled backward just as the earth beneath the rig began to tremble. A low, rumbling sound echoed from deep underground, like a freight train accelerating up a tunnel. At the edge of the property, Thomas Caldwell stopped laughing. He took off his sunglasses, his head tilting as he felt the vibration through the soles of his expensive leather boots. Suddenly, a deafening roar shattered the quiet afternoon. A geyser of brown mud exploded from the borehole, shooting 50 feet into the air. The mud showered down on the rig, on Joanne, and on Lawson. For a terrifying second, Joanne thought they had struck a pocket of natural gas. But as the mud cleared, the color of the eruption changed. It turned from dark brown to a frothy white. And then, brilliantly, beautifully clear, it was water. An immense, roaring pillar of crystal clear water erupted into the Texas sky, cascading down over the parched, cracked earth. The pressure was staggering, a raw, kinetic display of nature's hidden power. It rained down on Joanne, soaking her clothes, washing away the grease and the dust and the despair of the last month. She fell to her knees in the mud, laughing hysterically, the cool, pure water rushing over her face. Lawson stood on the rig, drenched, staring at the geyser in absolute awe. He tasted the water running down his face. It was sweet, cold, and entirely free of the sulfur and salt that plagued the upper aquifers of Hollis County. Down at the property line, the Caldwell brothers stood paralyzed. The color had completely drained from Thomas's face. He knew exactly what that kind of pressure meant. They hadn't just hit a puddle. Joanne Higgins had just tapped into the legendary, untouched, deep fault aquifer, a geological gold mine that sat directly beneath the worthless land he had practically given away. The Devil's Skillet was no longer a wasteland. It was the most valuable piece of real estate in the entire state of Texas, and the war for it was just about to begin. The roaring geyser on the Devil's Skillet flowed for 3 glorious, muddy hours before David Lawson managed to wrestle a heavy steel valve over the wellhead and lock it down. The sudden silence that fell over the 50 acres was deafening, broken only by the sound of rushing water pooling into newly formed lakes across the cracked hardpan. Joanne Higgins sat on the bumper of her rusted pickup, completely soaked, staring at the steel cap holding back a force of nature she could scarcely comprehend. She had won, or so she thought. By the following Tuesday, the magnitude of her discovery had been quantified, and it was staggering. Lawson had called in a favor from an old contact, a state geological surveyor named Gregory Finch. Finch had driven down from Austin under the cover of darkness, bringing a mobile testing laboratory in the back of his van. After drawing samples from the wellhead and running them through a battery of chemical and pressure diagnostics, Finch sat in Joanne's cramped kitchen trailer, his face pale with disbelief. "You didn't just hit a pocket of water, Miss Higgins," Finch explained, sliding a dense printout across the table. "You tapped into a subterranean pressurized reservoir. Because of the fault line dynamics, Lawson identified this water as pristine. It's naturally filtered through miles of limestone, completely free of agricultural runoff. Based on the pressure gauges, the volume is astronomical. If you sold the commercial extraction rights, or simply leased the water to the neighboring counties suffering from the drought, this well is worth at least $40 million, probably more." Joanne felt the room spin. $40 million. Less than a month ago, she had been counting pennies to afford canned soup, humiliated and broken by the men who rule this valley. Now, she was sitting on a fortune that rivaled the entire Caldwell empire. But Thomas and Henry Caldwell were not men who lost gracefully. The moment they realized the true value of what they had signed away for $5,000, their amusement curdled into a vicious, predatory panic. The Caldwells' own agricultural operations were heavily dependent on the region's upper aquifer, which was slowly depleting. Whoever controlled Joanne's new deep-water well essentially controlled the future of Hollis County. They needed that land back, and they were willing to tear Joanne apart to get it. The siege began with a phone call. Thomas Caldwell offered Joanne $1 million for the deed. When she hung up on him, the offer jumped to $5 million. She didn't even answer the second time. That was when the velvet glove came off, revealing the iron fist underneath. On a sweltering Thursday morning, two heavily armed deputies from the Hollis County Sheriff's Department pulled onto her property. They nailed a thick packet of legal documents to a wooden post near her trailer. It was an emergency cease and desist order signed by Judge Harmon, a man whose election campaigns were entirely funded by Caldwell money. The injunction claimed that Joanne's unregulated drilling posed a catastrophic seismic threat to the county's geological stability and cited a vaguely worded, decades-old ordinance regarding unregistered subterranean extraction. She was legally barred from opening her wellhead under threat of immediate arrest and asset forfeiture. "They're starving you out," Lawson growled later that afternoon, pacing around the capped well. "They know you can't afford a protracted legal battle. They're going to tie this up in local courts for years until you go bankrupt and the bank forecloses. Then they'll buy the property back at auction for pennies." The legal blockade was only the beginning of the intimidation. 3 nights later, Joanne woke up to the terrifying sound of shattering glass. She scrambled out of bed, grabbing a heavy steel wrench. The windows of her pickup truck had been completely smashed in. It was worse when she ran out to the drilling site. She found that Lawson's expensive rotary rig had been sabotaged. The hydraulic line slashed, thick black fluid bleeding into the dirt. A dead rattlesnake had been left coiled on top of the wellhead cap, a clear, sickening message. The local town of Stanton completely shut her out. The hardware store suddenly refused to sell her replacement parts for her truck. The local grocery store manager told her, with a deeply apologetic look, that his suppliers were running low, and he couldn't serve her. The Caldwells were leveraging every ounce of their economic power to make Joanne a ghost in her own community. Isolation and fear began to gnaw at her edges. She was a widow, living alone on a desolate patch of dirt, facing a multi-million-dollar syndicate that controlled the local law enforcement. But Thomas Caldwell had fundamentally miscalculated one crucial detail. Joanne had already survived the worst life could throw at her. She had watched the man she loved slowly fade away in a hospital bed. She had lost everything once before. She was no longer afraid of bullies in expensive suits. With her local avenues completely blockaded, Joanne realized she couldn't fight a rigged war in Hollis County. She needed a monster of her own. She took her last piece of collateral, the deed to the $40 million well, and hitchhiked 300 miles to Austin. She walked into the sleek, glass-paneled offices of Patricia Davies, a legendary corporate litigator known for utterly destroying corrupt municipal monopolies. Davies was ruthless, brilliant, and expensive. Joanne didn't have a retainer, but she had Finch's geological report. Davies read the report in silence. A slow, dangerous smile spread across the attorney's face. "The Caldwells own the local judge," Davies murmured, tapping her manicured nails on the mahogany desk. "But they don't own the Federal Water Commission. Miss Higgins, I'm taking your case on contingency. We aren't just going to break their injunction. We are going to rip their empire down to the studs." The retaliation was swift, brutal, and entirely outside the jurisdiction of Hollis County. Patricia Davies didn't bother filing motions with Judge Harmon. Instead, she bypassed the local judiciary entirely, securing an emergency hearing in a federal district court in Austin under the Clean Water Act and interstate commerce regulations, effectively stripping the Caldwells of their home field advantage. When Thomas and Henry Caldwell swaggered into the federal courtroom on a rainy Tuesday morning, they brought a team of 5 expensive corporate lawyers. They expected a quick victory, assuming they could easily crush the lone widow and her Austin attorney with a barrage of bureaucratic red tape. They looked at Joanne, who was sitting quietly in a tailored but modest suit, and smirked. They had no idea they were walking into an ambush. Davies stood before the federal magistrate and didn't just argue for the lifting of the injunction. She launched a devastating counteroffensive. She called Gregory Finch to the stand. Under oath, the state geologists laid out the exact mapping of the tectonic microfault beneath the Devil's Skillet. But Davies didn't stop at Joanne's well. She pulled out a massive, newly commissioned satellite hydrology map of the entire Hollis County basin. "Your Honor," Davies announced, her voice echoing sharply through the wood-paneled courtroom, "the defense claims my client's deep water well poses a threat to the region's geological stability. However, federal satellite data over the last 10 years shows a severe, unnatural depletion of the upper aquifer, a depletion that directly aligns with the boundaries of the Caldwell family's 10,000 acres. Thomas Caldwell's smirk instantly vanished. His lead attorney jumped up to object, but Davies sliced through the interruption. "We requested a federal audit of the Caldwell's agricultural pumps yesterday morning, preempting this hearing," Davies continued, handing a thick dossier to the judge. "The audit revealed that the Caldwells have been utilizing illegal, high-capacity turbine pumps to siphon millions of gallons of restricted upper aquifer water beyond their legal quota. They haven't just been watering their own crops. They have been actively draining the water table beneath their neighbors' farms, slowly forcing local farmers into bankruptcy so they could acquire their land cheaply." The courtroom erupted into whispers. Henry Caldwell turned ash-white. The secret to their massive yields and their expanding empire wasn't superior farming. It was systematic, large-scale water theft. Davies delivered the final blow. "When my client tapped into the pressurized lower aquifer, the shift in subterranean pressure caused a temporary backflow in the upper water table. This geological anomaly is what triggered the alarms on the Caldwell's illegal pumps, exposing their operation. They didn't file this injunction to protect the county, Your Honor. They filed it because Joanne Higgins accidentally blew the lid off a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The federal magistrate adjusted his glasses, staring down at the damning evidence. The Caldwells' legal team sat frozen, realizing they had been utterly blindsided. There was no defense against the federal data. The gavel fell with the force of a thunderclap. The federal judge not only immediately dissolved the Caldwells' injunction against Joanne, but he also issued a federal freeze on all Caldwell agricultural operations pending a full criminal investigation by the Environmental Protection Agency. Furthermore, the judge ordered the Caldwell brothers to pay Joanne Higgins $2 million in punitive damages for harassment and property destruction. As the court adjourned, Thomas Caldwell looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. The empire his grandfather had built, the monopoly he had ruthlessly maintained, had unraveled in less than 2 hours. He locked eyes with Joanne across the aisle. There was no amusement left in his gaze, only a hollow, terrified realization of his own ruin. Joanne didn't gloat. She simply held his stare for a long moment, picked up her briefcase, and walked out into the Texas rain, a free woman. The transformation of Hollis County over the next 2 years was nothing short of miraculous. With the Caldwell brothers facing federal indictments and massive fines, their land was broken up and sold at auction to the very families they had previously driven out. Joanne Higgins never sold the Devil's Skillet. Instead, she entered into a highly lucrative, environmentally conscious leasing agreement with the state, allowing them to pipe a strictly regulated percentage of her deep well water to drought-stricken municipal reservoirs. The $40 million valuation proved accurate. She used a portion of her sudden wealth to fully compensate David Lawson, buying him a state-of-the-art drilling company of his own. As for the 50 acres of cracked, barren earth, Joanne finally built her dream. She imported rich topsoil and utilized a fraction of her pristine water to cultivate a massive, thriving botanical farm. Where there was once only dust and broken drill bits, acres of vibrant purple lavender, sprawling agave, and lush aloe plants now swayed in the wind. The air no longer smelled of dry dirt, but of sweet, blooming life. She built a beautiful, wraparound porch house near the center of the property, overlooking the very spot where she had once fallen to her knees in despair. Joanne had taken the most worthless piece of ground in Texas and turned it into an oasis, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are buried beneath the hardest surfaces, and that those who try to bury others often end up digging their own graves. Joanne's incredible journey reminds us that true grit and a refusal to be bullied can unearth miracles from the most barren circumstances. The Caldwells tried to bury a desperate widow, completely unaware she was the seed that would dismantle their corrupt empire and bring life back to a dying town. If you were captivated by this story of poetic justice and ultimate revenge, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a great underdog triumph, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life dramas.